Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to this Q&A session with Mr. Michael Clinch. Today we're going to be talking about, in particular from the legal side of things, but we're going to be talking about two main areas. We're going to talk about protecting your business in these turbulent times, but also we're going to talk about some of the opportunities that may lay out there by way of acquisition, distressed acquisition, buying of assets, etc. going forward. So with that said, let me introduce you to my long-standing legal advisor and friend, Mr. Michael Clinch. Michael, hello.
Hello. Hi, Dan. Hi, everybody.
Just as a starter for 10, Michael, could you give us a 30-second rundown as to your background? I mean, hopefully those on the line trust that if I've used you for many years with a variety of both problems and business acquisitions I've been involved with, that should carry some weight. But for those that don't know or aren't convinced, could you give us a little bit of a context of your background, your career trajectory?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, it's been some years since we first met, and we're working together now. I'm a lawyer with a firm in London called Causeway Law. I'm a partner there. Originally, I qualified in Australia. I came over here in 1996 for a year, and I'm here. We, as a boutique law firm, we deal with commercial work, so buying and selling businesses. My area is dispute resolution, insolvency, that sort of thing. As a law firm, we cover anything for business, employment law, intellectual property. We don't do matrimonial work. We don't do work for business, and particularly closely held businesses for high net worth individuals or SMEs, where we're dealing one-to-one with the business owner, generally speaking.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. So for the guys that have just joined us, people are still joining us now. Hello, Caroline. Feel free to ask questions as we go. I'm going to loosely break this into two halves. The first half is going to be, I'm going to be asking Michael questions as it relates to protection. As Michael said, his expertise is broad, but we'll ask the questions. I'm sure I'm going to get flooded with questions about furloughing and the like, which may or may not be applicable here. But anything that you're curious about as it relates to insolvency, and there's been a lot of changes in the law there recently, first, and protecting you in the economic downturn that is upon us, and then we'll switch to the more opportunistic side. So, and I'll kick us off, Michael. Perhaps a useful point to start is, let's start by scaring everybody. Let's talk about what is insolvency, what does that mean, and then perhaps what are the risks or the consequences, because I think a lot of people may be on here that have heard the word but don't understand the definition, nor do they understand the consequences of trading whilst insolvent, for example.
Okay, so first of all, let's just limit what we're talking about to corporate insolvency as opposed to personal insolvency. There's a difference between the bankruptcy of a human being, which is called personal insolvency, and the insolvency of companies, which is corporate insolvency. So we're going to be talking about corporate insolvency today. The definition of what is insolvent is a statutory definition. It's a two-part definition. Those two definitions are then sort of weighed up together. The first is, can you pay your debts as they fall due? Are you paying your bills as they come in? And if you're not, then you are insolvent. The second is a balance sheet test. As I say, those two tests are looked at, and the cumulative effect of them is weighed up by the courts. So you can actually be balance sheet technically insolvent because there's no way you can pay your debts. So that's insolvency. Insolvent, the directors then have very clear. Is our connection unstable? Are you getting me?
I am, but it is getting a bit choppy, so I will kill the videos at this point, everybody. So I'll stop Michael's video. I'll stop my own as well. Okay, please continue, Michael.
Sorry about that. I think I'm in a bit of a dodgy area. So for videos. We were talking about what directors' duties are. The director of a company has generally got obligations to the shareholders in a solvent situation. So the director's duties are generally to the shareholders. If, however, a company becomes insolvent on one of the two tests that I've mentioned, the director's duties then immediately flip to be an obligation to the creditors and not so much the shareholders. So the duty of the director then is to look after the creditors, and the law basically says that once a company becomes insolvent, the director should immediately take professional advice, and the professional then will advise whether it's appropriate to look at administration, liquidation, etc.
So Michael, if I may interject, and obviously we now can't see each other, so I'll probably be rudely speaking over you more frequently, but so a lot of companies right now specifically are struggling financially, and in normal, I know they've changed the rules, which we'll address in a moment, but in the normal course of practice, some inexperienced company directors turn around and just have the attitude of going, well, it's a limited company. It's a limited company, so I don't have personal liability. And yet, that's not true. So what are the, under the normal course of the law, previous extraordinary situation, what are the risks to the director if they are potential risks if they're trading whilst insolvent?
Okay, so as you rightly say, a company has a distinct legal personality to the individuals within it. So a company is, as far as the law is concerned, another separate legal entity, just like another person. And so the directors running the company can stand behind the company in for example, normal contractual dealings. If a company enters into a contract with another company, it is obviously those two companies that have the relationship, not the people behind it. And that's what's called the corporate veil, which probably our listeners have heard mentioned many times. And you can pierce the corporate veil in certain circumstances. Now, when you then also overlay an insolvency situation, you've got more exceptions to the rule. Where a company is insolvent, the directors, as I say, have legal duties. And if they trade the company on whilst it is insolvent, that can be what is called wrongful trading, which is a turn of phrase that's been flying around the media in the last couple of days for reasons that we'll talk about shortly. Wrongful trading essentially means, in colloquial terms, trading the company on when you clearly shouldn't be, with the result that the creditors are going to be far worse off due to your failure to comply with your duties as a director.
Yes. So in other words, if the brief summary would be that if somebody is trading wrongfully, that the fact that they're a limited company doesn't necessarily protect them. Ergo, they could be personally held liable for some of the losses.
That is exactly the point of it. So when a liquidator is appointed, he is obliged to look at what has been happening with the company, and if he decides that the directors have carelessly continued to trade the company for the last 6 months when they should have put it under 6 months earlier, and all the creditors as a result have got less money to distribute. So in other words, in that 6 month period, if the director has blown whatever cash was at bank, hoping for one last deal to come along and save the day, then the liquidator will say, hang on a minute, Mr. Director, you've blown this money that the creditors otherwise would have had. I'm going to ask you to put that back into the pot, please. So that's one of the ways the liquidator can redress the balance. The others are things like what's preference payments. So if the director causes the company to pay out his best mate or his mum or whatever in preference to other creditors, usually HMRC, often on the list at the end, then the director and the recipient of the money might be responsible to pay that back as what's called preference. You also get situations where when a company is about to go under, the director thinks, gosh, I can see that the end is near. I'm going to, I don't know, lose the block of land that I bought in the name of my company all those years ago when things were good. I'm just going to transfer it out for £1 to myself or to my great aunt or whatever. That isn't going to work either, because that's what's called a transfer at under value. And all these things can be unpicked for various rules that exist in the Insolvency Act.
So I've got a great question that's just come in, Michael, which I'll throw in. It's a little bit out of left field, but then I'm going to jump across the current changes in the rules. So the headline for everybody, and I'm aware that a few more people have joined us. So hi, Marcus. Hi, Leighton. Hi, Emma. And hi, Alex, who the question is from. But the overarching principle I see is you need to get educated, guys. This is why we're doing calls like this, because what you don't know will hurt you. Ignorance is definitely not bliss. And I suspect that whilst the medical circumstances are terrible right now, and some people will unfortunately lose their lives, I think the economic impact is going to be significant and carry on for a considerable length of time. And you don't want to do something, the defense of, well, I didn't know, or it was a panic because it was COVID-19 isn't going to help you in the eyes of the law. So I'm going to now jump sideways, Michael, if that's okay, to Alex's question. So Alex, if I remember correctly, Alex is a qualified accountant, but she is a business owner. So she says this, Michael: I acquired the assets of a business last year. I am paying for a percentage of the purchase in deferred consideration. So in layman's terms for the listeners, that means that she's got a payment plan for some of the purchase price over time.
An earn-out.
Correct. Actually, I don't know if it's an earn-out. It's just, it's a deferred consideration, because I believe it is a retail outlet, which has therefore been closed. Yeah, so Alex has said not an earn-out. Not an earn-out, just deferred consideration. Okay. I have been offered by the seller to defer these payments whilst the business is closed. I would like to take up this option. What do I need to consider, and are there any risks to this?
First of all, I think that's a pretty decent offer from the person on the other side. Very moral sort of thing to do. It clearly has to be documented properly, because there will be a contract, touch wood, that you'll be varying by doing this. So the original contract will say that X, Y, and Z amounts have to be paid on date this, date that, date the other. So a not complicated document should be signed saying that the obligation to make these payments on these dates is suspended or cancelled, or whatever the case may be, so that you're not going to be in breach of the agreement by doing so.
Correct.
So it's a question of, basically it's a question of communication and recording what you're doing, and recorded in writing so that there can be no confusion later on. You don't want to find that in 6 months' time they go bust and their liquidator starts chasing you for money that they say is overdue.
Yes.
For example.
So Alex, I hope that answers the question. Obviously, anybody ask questions as we go, and I'll do my best to work everybody's questions in. I know a question that I've been asked by many people prior to this call, Michael, is about landlords. So, and it can be situation specific, as in the environment today, because I know that the rules are changed. We have, Michael, on this call, both people whose businesses they are a landlord, or that they have landlords because they rent their premises, and immediately everyone's going into the cash flow panic. Can they defer? Can they just not pay? What are the kind of key points or considerations, as you see it, that they should be weighing up? Let's take the position of assuming that they've just got a landlord, so they rent their office premises, for example.
Okay, so where to start with that, because it raises quite a few issues. The starting point, of course, is that there will be a rental agreement or a lease in place, which on the face of it will continue to apply, and the obligation to pay rent continues. Hopefully, landlords will be sensible and will agree some sort of suspension or reduction or whatever. I know that a lot of people are taking the view that they're just not going to pay the rent. That's not any legal advice from me, but I know that people are doing that. And I suspect that that is relatively effective because the courts are shut down and it's very difficult to do very much about it. But there's a massive risk in that strategy for obvious reasons. So the starting point for me would be to approach the landlord and try and have an adult discussion about it. I know that some landlords, particularly the landlords who are offering, for example, short-term office accommodation on sort of month to month, or the Regis type stuff.
Yes.
They have a reputation at the moment of being particularly brutal and not allowing people not to pay, probably because they have to pay their own bankers or something. But there is, I'm not a property lawyer, so I'll say that first of all, but I am aware that there is discussion about the introduction of legislation to prevent any commercial leases being terminated during this coronavirus lockdown period. I can't tell you where that is at the moment, but that's worth further investigation if you are potentially looking at a breach that you can't do anything about and the landlord is not listening. So keep an eye on how that is going. But then there's the further point, which is a bit sort of technical. There's a legal doctrine called frustration. There's also a legal doctrine called force majeure. Again, have a look at your contract to see how these may or may not apply to your situation. Do you want me to give you a quick rundown on what frustration and force majeure is, or is that those terms that your people be familiar with?
No, I think, well, I think there's so many topics I want to cover at a high level, Michael. Unless people want to know, if you want to know, make a comment and I will bring Michael back to it. But you've brought up another comment or a question for me, Michael, because this is about how do we avoid, before we talk about the opportunities, we're talking about protection. How do we avoid people making a mistake? So here's a circumstance from one of my business interests, Michael, that happened recently. I have a business that has that rents an office premises, and so I chose to give notice because it was on a short-term arrangement. So everything was current. I chose to give notice and say, I'm very sorry, I need to give notice on this office premises because it wasn't actually a lease. It was under license, Michael, a monthly license, kind of like a Regis would do. Yep. And the office manager came back and said something which a lot of people on this call will get, but I think some are missing the difference between reduction in payment, payment breaks, payment holidays, and deferral. So I said, I wish to give notice. Please, can you confirm that I need to give 30 days notice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he came back and said, if I suggest a 3-month deferred rental scheme, would that help? And then he says, in detail, it means you would pay your April rent, but not May, June, July. But then he goes on to say, the rent you would have not paid would be repaid in August to January inclusive. And I know some people on here are probably understand that fully, but I think some people in their panic think that by getting a quote unquote, they go, oh, I've got a payment holiday. That means I don't have to pay rent in May, June, and July. But they miss the fact that you are still obligated and liable to pay the rent later. Are you seeing much of that?
So
break down the terms that people are using: payment holiday, payment break, deferral. Anything they should be looking out for, I suppose?
Well, you've hit on something which I think is at the heart of any legal relationship, and that is communication. So all that a legal document is a clear recording of an understanding. It's a way of communicating a position between parties, and in litigation you must communicate, and in all sorts of legal scenarios communication is key. If you don't communicate, the whole problem escalates into a dispute. So what you say is deferred payments. All the deferred means don't pay now but pay later. It's not a write-off of the months of the May, June, July that you mentioned. It's just a deferral. It's just clear language. Anything that you agree, of course, you need to document, and document clearly.
Yes. So changing tack a little bit. Let's talk now about. I was going to talk about. Let's talk about insolvency applications, or actually, let's talk about an example of that, HMRC specifically. And I know that the terms on this seem to be changing on an almost daily basis, Michael, but I sometimes hear people say things like, oh, I don't have to pay my VAT, which in cash terms appears to be correct for the current quarter. You do not have to pay it now, but you still have to file.
I do not pay my VAT yet.
Correct. So that's better language, i.e. you don't have to pay it now, but you do have to pay it, and you do have to file the returns. And have you got any thoughts, Michael, moving on to talking about debt and financing of debt? I'm aware that this is a very, you'll handle it appropriately, how you seem to answer it. Some people are going, oh, I need to go and borrow money. I need to, put money on my credit card. I need to go to a IOWOCA or a high interest lender to put the money in so I can pay my VAT bills, versus getting a business interruption loan. Probably an appropriate question would be not what should they do, but what considerations should they bear in mind as to doing that versus, for example, arranging a time to pay arrangement with HMRC?
Yeah. So you're right. It's not for me to tell people what to do in this scenario. I'm not a financial advisor. But the obvious point to make from what you've said, of course, is that the consequences of going out and getting a short-term, payday lending type loan is that you will have to pay it back, and you will have to pay the interest that they charge. So weigh that up against the other alternatives. Should you furlough your staff? Is it cheaper for you to do that? Should you look to enter into a time to pay arrangement with, for example, HMRC, and retain cash that way? Should you tote it up and just say, oh gosh, I'm really, even with all of these things, going to have to look at a restructuring? It might be cheaper, it might be more business sensible for you to restructure your existing enterprise down, potentially by way of some sort of rationalization of your staff, potentially by way of a voluntary arrangement, potentially by way of maybe even administration and coming out the other side in the worst case scenario. All of these things may be cheaper and more sensible than borrowing lots of cash. Let's just tie this into where we started with the wrongful trading. Someone who's in the situation that you've just talked about obviously is facing or is in insolvency and has to consider the rights of the creditors, which is what I said the director's obligations were. And if they don't and create a bigger black hole than otherwise existed, they might be pursued for wrongful trading. It is that which has been the subject of some discussion and some interim law in the last week, whereby the directors will not be prosecuted, apparently, for wrongful trading during this coronavirus period. There's a lot of bells and whistles to that. It's not an absolute statement. So okay, at one level, the director is not going, it can safely, for example, not put off staff or not stop incurring liability on credit to suppliers, or not bother about the consequences of taking these big loans from a wrongful trading point of view. But that doesn't mean that at the end of the coronavirus lockdown period, he's going to have a business left.
Right.
So, and so you can't just assume that during this period you ignore all of these issues, and then when you're out the other side, have a look at it then. You've actually got to constantly monitor where you are the changes to the insolvency laws don't change that. You've got to constantly monitor where you are and work out what is right for your business now, rather than what it might be at the end of the lockdown period.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm paraphrasing slightly, but I love the way that you word it in relation to there's a lot of bells and whistles, i.e. people, because there's so much noise right now, Michael, it seems to me that a lot of people take a headline and extrapolate it for being an undeniable, indisputable fact. Whether that be the variety of conspiracy theories that are going around, which we won't go into, or whether it be as simple as, oh, I've read you can't be prosecuted for wrongful trading. Therefore, I can do whatever the hell I like, and then I can just liquidate the company if I need to. I can empty the business bank account into my pocket and then just liquidate the company. And clearly, if anybody's bothered to read the legal updates, which I'm happy to provide links to various articles and things and the sources where you can study them for yourself, it clearly clarifies that there are a lot of nuances, which basically, I'm paraphrasing Michael, and jump in if you disagree with me here, it's that they will be almost slightly more lenient, i.e. they're not going to throw you under the bus for wrongful trading for a very small short-term discretion that was caused by your stock becoming unavailable, or that was caused by, you furloughing your staff late or early, or, relatively minor indiscretions. It's not a carte blanche, do what the hell you like.
So you're right, but let me put it back to you this way. It's wrongful trading is off the table, but everything else is still there. So I mentioned earlier things like preferences and transfers at undervalue. They're all still there. You can't just say, "Oh, great, I'm in a coronavirus lockdown. I'll just take all the money out and run away." That you'll still have liquidators and HMRC coming after you. There is also a general sort of principle called misfeasance, which was basically a director doing wrong in a broad sense, and a director who does wrong in a particular context is also going to be sued personally. So in the scenario you just mentioned about running the company around for another couple of months, taking all the money out and then putting it down, isn't going to work.
Yeah, I mean, this is only my opinion, guys, but I strongly suspect there's an awful lot of people are going to get in very hot water for what effectively is fraud after all this passes, because so many people are blatantly disregarding the rules as it relates to furloughing. And i.e., Michael, I've heard of, not saying amongst our clients, but in the wider business marketplace, people that are furloughing staff and yet still getting them to work, and, and backdating furloughing inappropriately so, in order to take advantage of some of the reliefs. I heard of a landlord yesterday, again, outside of our network for absolute avoidance of doubt, who had gone and, he wasn't a landlord. He had a few different limited companies, but he had a friend who was a landlord, and they went and made up some leases for different office buildings, backdated it, so in effect he could qualify for the relief or the funding or whatever the break was on that. It was completely fabricated, and therefore it is, out by my judgment, out and out fraud. And it's not to say you wouldn't get away with it, but put it this way, it's not a game that I would want to play.
Well, honestly, that's a criminal offence, what you just described.
Yeah, I think so, and I don't know this person closely, so I chose not to even comment. But the fact that he was sharing it, it was in a small group of people, but on social media, a private group of only about 20 people. But the fact that he was sharing it so openly was big belief. Yeah. And I think it was a kind of a property investor type group as to, hey guys, look at how I've done this. Aren't I clever? And I think an awful lot of people are going to find themselves in some very deep hot water. So I suppose, Michael, behind all this is why the people listening to this call, why you're part of this mastermind group, so you can get multiple points of reference and learn from mistakes and observe different points of view, but also get access to experts like yourself. So they're making sure that they are making an informed decision. You know, if somebody chose to do something that's a little close to the wire, so be it. But at least they can do so once they're in place of the facts, not just running around blindly just because they've heard somebody somewhere tell them it was a good idea and you're going to get away with it. Whew. Yeah. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now. And so let's talk briefly. We're almost at the time where we're going to talk about the opportunities, but I think this will be the segue anyway, Michael. In that there are a few people that I won't name by name unless they give me permission to in the Q&A, but there are some people on this call whose businesses have been extremely affected, and therefore, if we weren't in COVID-19, you'd say they are insolvent, and therefore they're asking questions about insolvency procedures versus, say, if they can get the interruption loan. So I know you've always got to weigh it up, but how would somebody know whether or not they should consider the variety of insolvency procedures? So it probably might be best to say, give us a super quick rundown as to insolvency procedures, what they are, their names, and then how might somebody begin to even weigh up whether or not that's appropriate versus just seeing if they can go and get a loan? Okay,
so let's start with this. I mentioned earlier that what the test of insolvency is. If you are insolvent, you have an obligation to consider whether or not you should be looking at formal insolvency processes, so full stop, coronavirus or none. So if you are insolvent, you should approach an insolvency practitioner or a solicitor or an accountant, someone who's qualified to advise you. And that person should then hopefully give you the guidance that you need to decide whether or not you can continue to trade. So some people will come to you and say, I'm just in a cash flow crisis, but if you map it out, I'll be out of this in 6 months. If that can be justified and you can get, for example, an accountant to back that up with an analysis, then that might allow you to trade on. If, however, there is no way out, then you need to be looking at things like what's called administration or liquidation, or alternatively what's called a voluntary arrangement. So let's do voluntary arrangement first. That is basically a contract with the creditors. You go to an insolvency practitioner. The insolvency practitioner makes a proposal to the creditors that they all take XP in the pound effectively to call it quits with you. So it's a contract with your creditors that is not done through the courts. It's done through a formal process authorised under the Insolvency Act. And the XP in the pound can either be a lump sum paid by your granny, or you can pay it off over time or something like that. And it ring fences those debts and allows you then to carry on that business going forward without the worry of being.
So jumping on the CVA as an example, Michael, I mean, a lot of the guys listening, hey Shaylin, hey Steve, or 3 Steves on this call, have been familiar in the press. CVAs have been made famous by a lot of the big department stores, you know, the Debenhams of this world, etc., whereby they get a CVA which allows them to secure things like rent reductions. And probably the distinction here is, remember guys, this is a reduction in debt. It is not getting debt or just deferral of payment terms. It's actually, in effect, a negotiated reduction, which means the debt goes down.
Goes away.
Indeed. Why would people do this, Michael? As in, why would
the creditor do it?
Yes.
Because the insolvency practitioner who proposes this on your behalf does so wearing a hat called nominee, and the nominee prepares a report that goes to all of the creditors and says, I've had a look at this. I'm an independent insolvency practitioner, and the proposal has been prepared on the basis that you all take say 30p in the pound in full and final settlement and call it quits, or Mr. Director is going to sell his house and put the money into the company, and that's going to be used to give you all 25p in the pound. That you would never otherwise have got. If you don't take this, you'll get zero. And that's why creditors are willing to do it. Something is better than nothing. And if the proposal is written so that the creditors can clearly see that it is the best option, and it only should go out to the creditors if it is the best option, then that is why it is often accepted.
Yes.
And then if it is accepted, the nominee becomes the monitor of the scheme. He then changes from nominee to what's called supervisor. It's his job to then bring in the money that is going to be distributed to the creditors at this 30p in the pound. When he's done his job, the CVA is discharged, and the company goes back to the way it was before, as if nothing has happened. It's the same company. There's no liquidation. There's no change of legal capacity. It's just the same company that's had process applied to it, and then it comes out the other side.
Yes. So I'm going to change tack now. I've got one final question on protection, Michael, and then I want to talk about the opportunities that might come as a result of this crisis. But to wrap this up for the guys, and CVA, a voluntary arrangement is just an example of procedures. If you owed, hypothetically speaking, if a company owed HMRC £100,000 and they were able to succeed in getting a CVA for 30p in the pound, what that would mean is you would repay £30,000 worth of debt. The other £70,000 worth of debt would have disappeared. And yet, of course, there are fees. You might have paid £5,000 or £10,000 worth of fees to get to that point. But then you're significantly further ahead than going and getting a loan for £100,000 to pay the debt and having interest on that loan, and maybe having to give your personal guarantee. So the point I want to make to everybody listening is, here isn't meant to be tell you what to do. It's meant to open your eyes and ears, and there's no substitute for getting the right advice. And obviously we're going to give Michael's details at the end if you wish to explore any of these further.
One quick thing before we leave the protection side, Dan, I'll mention it very quickly. The other novel area of protection that is coming in, being discussed, is what's called a breathing space moratorium. That's at least what the press is calling it. And it essentially is that a company can go to someone such as an insolvency practitioner and have the insolvency practitioner cast a moratorium over creditor action for a limited period. It's been thrown around between 28 days and 3 months. So basically putting a freeze on any collection or any court proceedings against you during this moratorium period. As far as I'm aware, it's not yet in, and it's not yet nailed down as to how it's going to work, but it is this sort of new, novel, additional area of protection that they're talking about at the moment as coronavirus specific.
Excellent. Yeah, so watch this space, guys. Again, I will do my best to keep everybody in this group up to date with information that I see it when I see it or read it from reputable sources. But equally, there's no substitute for having the right experts in your corner. Oh, so Michael, I'm trying to get off this, but I've had 3 questions now come in, or 2 of them related to CVAs. So I'm going to actually answer these since I'm getting multiple questions on it before we move on to the some of the exciting opportunities that the companies that are struggling might present to some of the people in this group that are in a position to take advantage. So well, I'm going to assume all these questions are unnamed. So let's try and do these briefly Michael, and then we'll just say, great, I can put them in touch with you afterwards if we want to elaborate. So one person says, if you enter a voluntary arrangement with, say, HMRC, does that same arrangement apply to all other creditors?
Yes, so a voluntary arrangement is in fact with all of your creditors. It's not with one specific creditor. So the whole idea of it is to catch every creditor.
Yes. So the person that asked that question, I'm happy to put you in touch, but yes, as Michael said, it's voted upon by the creditors to get it through. And the other person said, can you get a CVA agreed if you have a personal guarantee on the debt?
You can, but the PG. So think of it this way: the company voluntary arrangement is a voluntary arrangement on behalf of the company. The personal guarantee that you've given is your own personal obligation that sits away from that. So they're sort of, to that extent, unrelated.
Yes. So to make an example for the person that asked this question, if it wasn't HMRC you owed £100,000 to, but a loan company that you'd given a director's personal guarantee on, even if the creditor agreed to a CVA at 30p in the pound, like the made-up example we just gave, the company would repay £30,000, but in all probability, the lender is going to say to you personally, you still need to repay the other 70.
Yep.
There's nuances around that person that asked the question, but that are worth exploring, but probably outside of the extent of this call. Okay, so finally on this topic, and then I'm going to move on to the opportunities, guys, which I think is well worth listening to. Should we use the same approach to collecting debts as we normally would do, or is a different approach advisable? It's an interesting question.
Do you know what I'd say? This is business suggestion, not legal advice. What I'm telling people to do is to change the way they do business and get money up front wherever possible.
Yeah, good. I like that, and I agree with that. My answer for what it's worth, actually, this wasn't a CVA-related question, so I can say the person's name. This was Alex, again, that asked this particular question about collecting money in. While I agree with what Michael just said, I would also say, reinforce something Michael said earlier, which is about communication. I think there's so many nuances about getting payment. It depends on your relationship with that person, because you may be in a position where it's better for you to create the goodwill if you can support that key customer, possibly. Not always, but so I agree with Michael. If you can get paid in advance, I think cash is king. I think you all know me well enough to know that. And at the same time, this situation will pass, and people have long memories. So I think treating people fairly doesn't mean let yourself get walked over, Alex, but treating people fairly and having good, clear dialogue. That's what I'm saying to the landlords. Should you let people have rent breaks? Should you lock them out of the premises? Well, you need to follow the law, but I think you having in-depth conversations, which is one of the reasons why we said to you, you need to be on top of your cash flow, because how do you know what you can afford to pay versus not pay? If you've not got cash flow forecasts, etc., you haven't got clarity of thinking. So I think the communication element is paramount. So, Michael, running behind schedule a little bit, but let's talk about opportunities. So as I see it, and some of the people that are on this list have bought companies in the past via a variety of different means, but as I see it, a lot of companies, given the sudden economic downturn that we're facing, despite these government support, despite leniency on payment terms, etc., still will fail. And what that means is for people that are poised and survive this downturn, they might be in a position to take advantage by buying companies or buying assets. And again, conceptually, to use a metaphor of a house for those listening, I'm not teaching Michael to suck eggs, in case you're wondering, those are listening, this is aimed at you. Metaphorically, if a property is £100,000 and it drops by 30%, if you can afford to buy the house for £70,000, and have it be rented out and make a profit, and then have the market rebound over the coming years, that might be maybe worthwhile you taking advantage of that. And with companies, I see the discounts can often be significantly more than 30%. Things like a competitor fails, but they've got an order book where you can legitimately and legally buy their order book and take on, grow your revenues by 50% overnight and just incorporate them into your existing operation. So there's massive upside, but equally, there can be massive risk if you don't know what you're doing. So Michael, could I ask you to start this off by telling the story we discussed the other day about an acquaintance saw the opportunity to buy a competitor, and talking about what that means? Because I think that kind of that's a great example.
So this is a little story. Sound like none of screwy about this fellow was looking to expand his type of business into the north of England, and there was a competitor in the north of England who had the market up there, and they got talk. This is not in any sort of situation where there was a downturn or any insolvency. They got talking, and discussions progressed to the point where the guy up north decided that he would sell his business to my guy. And they negotiated it all on the basis that my guy would buy the shares in the operation up there, and all would be well. And I can't remember now. I think he was looking to pay about $500,000 or something for it.
Yes. Yeah, so it was your client was going to buy a competitor's company, i.e., buy the shares. So it was going to buy competitor North Limited for tentatively agreed for £500,000.
Yeah, and of course, everybody wants to try and sell the shares to get entrepreneurs relief and so on. So all of this had happened before my fellow had come to see me. We're talking about 15 years ago. And he came to see me and he said, I've got this deal on the books. I just want you to do a share sale agreement. And I said, what do you know about this company? Oh, not much, but he's got all the north zone up, and I want that coverage. So, well, to be honest, if you can get away with buying the assets rather than the shares, I'd suggest you do that, because you do realize that if you buy the shares in the company, you get that company warts and all. You get all the bad bits along with all the good bits. And so he thought about this, and so that's what we did. We did an asset sale for much the same price, and we bought the business out of the company rather than bought the shares in the company.
So just to interject there, Michael, just for those that are perhaps less experienced, so said a different way, rather than buying the 100 shares in Northern Competitor Limited for the £500,000, the client, Michael's client, went and said, okay, we want to buy your client list, this website domain name, a list of assets from your company. So we're going to buy those things and move them into my company or some company.
Buy the tables and chairs.
Yeah, great.
So and so we did. And then a month or two later, this chap rang me up and he said, how's it going? So he said, how's it going with you? How's the northern thing going? He said, well, funny thing, thank God I took your advice, because about a week after we did the deal, a letter arrived from HMRC addressed to the old company that he didn't buy, asking where the £1 million was that they were demanding payment for unpaid tax from previous years. So had he gone ahead with the deal that he was going to do, he would have bought a company with £1 million liability that he would have had to pay.
Right.
But the way that we did it, he didn't buy that liability. It stayed behind in the old company, and he didn't touch it.
Yeah, it's such a great point, Michael. So the thing I want to say for everybody here is, it's the importance of not being cheap. If this individual, Michael's client, had been cheap and succeeded in going to or even worse, going to one of these websites and downloading a template for 20 quid or something and saying, hey, great, let's swap out these shares, and succeeded, he would have paid £500,000 for a company that would have gone broke, probably, because I'm sure he wouldn't have paid the £1 million tax liability, and he would have been screwed, rather than getting the proper advice to understand strategically the best way to approach it, that either A, maximizes the upside, and or B, minimizes the risk. So moving on from that, Michael, there are some people on here, and I've already got questions coming in, which is good. In fact, the one that Parul has just asked was similar to what I was just about to ask you. Parul said, what's the best way to find these target companies, and or how do you approach them to buy their assets?
Oh, sorry, I'm losing you.
Oh, sorry, Michael. Can you hear me now? Uh-oh.
Dan, can you hear me?
Yes, Michael, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
All I got was a few electronic beeps. So can you start the question again?
Of course. So the question was, what's the best way to find these target companies, and how do you approach them to buy their assets, client list, or order books?
Okay. Always the most difficult question. It is very much a matter of chance, to be honest. Easier if you're looking for people in your own sector, because clearly you'll have, common acquaintances or whatever. You can go on to various different websites where insolvency practitioners market things for sale, but generally speaking, what goes on those sites isn't really, the cherry pickings. It is a matter of creating a network with people such as valuation agents who work for insolvency practitioners, or insolvency practitioners themselves, or industry sort of regulators who are going to come across these things. So yeah, you've just got to develop your network. That is the only way to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'll add to it slightly, and perhaps give Michael a more specific question to answer, which is fundamentally keeping your nose to the ground, ear to the ground, excuse me, is the right metaphor, not your nose. Keeping your ear to the ground. I think it's advantageous to stay connected. Use this time. The way that I'm explaining it to my private clients at the moment is saying, look, you've got two jobs. One is to defend your existing business. So protect your existing client base, the money you've got coming in, et cetera, to cut unnecessary costs, as an example. But then on the other side, because we're really in the thick of it right now, in fact, at the time of recording this, which is the 2nd of April, 2020, we haven't yet hit the peak in the UK. I don't think the opportunities are really presenting themselves yet, and I don't think they will for a little while. But I do think strongly that now's the time to plant seeds, i.e., it's to be in the forums, it's to be connecting with the contacts that you've got on LinkedIn, it's to let them know, if appropriate, that you're open for business, that you're hiring, that you are looking to grow. It's to make those connections so that you are visible, but not so aggressive. And what I believe will happen is, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, maybe not next month, but at some point in the future, some of those people are going to be in trouble and think of you. They will be maybe made redundant by their company and they're a key employee, or they own the business and they're really struggling, but they happen to remember that you connected with them and let them know that, hey, you'd be happy to support them if they needed it. And therefore they reach out to you, and then that's the start of the conversation, Paul, as to, okay, can we do some kind of deal? So the question I'm going to ask Michael, the follow-on question, is about what kind of questions are worthwhile asking, or what considerations should they give? So if Parul, for example, Michael, was just approached by a competitor saying, hey, yeah, it's a nightmare here. I'm in a world of trouble. how might we do business together? What kind of questions might she ask to get a better understanding and thus be able to decide what to do? Uh-oh, that'll be anticlimactic if I've lost Michael. Are you still there, Michael? Okay. We might have lost Michael, so I'm going to answer that question myself whilst I quickly look at my phone and send Michael a message. Hold on one second. Keep your questions coming in, guys. I'm going to get Michael back online, hopefully, in a moment, and then we will be able to resume. Okay, let me just check it's all working. Okay, yeah, Michael says I've dropped out. He's trying to reconnect. Hopefully he'll reappear in a moment. So let me remove Michael from the meeting. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. He won't be able to rejoin. Okay, I'll let him try and reconnect. So I'll answer that question on behalf of Michael. So, Paul, Michael's already spoken about, if you're a buyer, you want to buy assets. If you're a seller, you nearly always want to sell your shares because of entrepreneur's relief. Oh, and I think we got Michael.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's okay. Don't worry. I was just starting to answer the question as to what questions might Parul ask a competitor, say, who's in a bit of trouble, that just comes saying, hey, yeah, I'm in a bit of trouble. Can you help me? What kind of questions might she ask in order to establish the...
All right, so you've got a competitor who would like to acquire, but they've actually come to you cap in hand to some extent. Correct,
yes.
So, well, I guess, again, it's communication. If you're interested in acquiring them, I would suggest that from the outset. I mean, you've got to look at every person that you're dealing with as a different opportunity, and they will have different views, different buttons to push. Work out what their buttons are and push those. But I think it pays to say, all right, well, if you're in trouble, I'm interested in talking to you about acquiring what you've got.
Yes. So in that example, Michael, and I am aware, guys, that these situations are always bespoke, because a little nuance, a little clause in a contract somewhere can literally shift it from being option A to option B. But Michael, for those that aren't aware of it, should we talk about the concept of SPVs? Because I think that's insightful. Especially, again, another mutual acquaintance of ours. In fact, that's a really good story to tell. He didn't buy and hopefully, Michael, without giving away, you'll figure out who I'm talking about by telling the story. He had a particular business that was successful and profitable. He didn't acquire a competitor. He instead decided to start a second location. And he started a second location.
Yes, it's dawned on me now what you're talking about.
Yeah, he started a second location, but he did it within the same limited company. And unfortunately, the second location failed to get traction, so it lost money. But in doing so, also the owner took his eye off the first location, which meant that both were losing money, but it was effectively, it was the same limited company, which meant that the company failed. It followed an insolvency procedure, but long story short, they didn't get good advice. It wasn't done well. And lo and behold, many years later, 5-6 years later, the director was pursued and ultimately was forced to pay out another chunk of money because they didn't do it the right way. And even though that wasn't, the director wasn't buying a second company, he just started a second location, I think it still would hold true. It would hold true if he'd been buying a competitor, that it would have been worthwhile using something called an SPV. So, Michael, if you could speak.
So there's a couple of
an SPV and why might it be advantageous?
Yeah, there's a couple of morals in that story. The first was that he took on a second site which had different characteristics it failed and pulled down both sites, pulled down the whole business. So he would have been better off if he had acquired the second site in a new company acquired specifically for the purpose. Special purpose vehicle is what SPV stands for. So if you have company number one running site number one, you should think about creating company number two to run site number two. Because if site number two turns out to be rubbish and it fails, you put down company number two, but you haven't pulled down company number one with it.
Yes.
You could structure it potentially so that you have a holding company over the top. The accountants out there will understand this, and that might be a way of, for example, on the nature of your business, you hive up or push up all of the intellectual property rights that you might need, which are the crown jewels in your organization, maybe the property as well, and you push them up into the holding company, but it doesn't trade. And the trading vehicles, the other subsidiaries that run site number one, site number two, or whatever, so that if one of those goes bad, you just cut that bit off, but you haven't lost everything else. The other moral of that story was that chap that you mentioned got hustled by an insolvency practitioner, and there are people out there in this profession who do it. Get advice. It's like, should you buy a kitchen from someone who comes to your door and says, I'm selling kitchens, but you've got 30 seconds to sign up? You don't. So the same principle applies. I think as well, this leads into using insolvency processes positively. When you have a competitor or just a target company that you're looking to acquire, because it is struggling, if it is insolvent, you don't want to be taking on its liabilities in the scenario that I mentioned before. You just want the good bits, you want the business. There are a number of ways to do that. The safest way to do it is to work with your seller to get him to put his company into administration or liquidation through a trusted insolvency practitioner and buy the assets through the insolvency. That means that you're getting the assets without having any of the skeletons in the closet that might come along with it. It is the safest way for you to buy.
Yeah.
It is the only way that I would recommend people to buy, unless this. Sometimes you can't do a sale through an administration or a liquidation, either A, because the legal requirements for administration can't be satisfied, which I won't bore you with, or B, you don't want to wait for the liquidation process to run its course, because in a month's time, the business might have lost all of its goodwill, particularly if it's a restaurant or something like that. You can do something called a pre-liquidation sale, which means that you get the business properly valued. You purchase the business for the valuation price, so that you've got support for what price you're paying, and then the old company is put into liquidation, again through a trusted liquidator, who will rely upon and accept, hopefully, the valuation that you've obtained on the basis that it's clearly an independent valuation, and he's not going to try and come after you for a top-up or to claim any sort of transfer it under value.
Yeah. So here would be my thoughts, guys, and then I'm going to go to the Q&A. So if you've got any quick questions, I'm going to probably wrap this session because we're already gone longer than anticipated, but I'm going to go through as many questions as I can in quick fire succession. So if you've got any questions, go through them, put them in now in the Q&A function where you're in the panel where you're logged in. Would be this. We haven't even scratched the surface here. It's not because we're trying to avoid giving you the information. It's just clearly Michael's a professional and with a multi-decade long career. He started when he was 3 years old. Michael's been in the profession for decades, but it's a very broad subject area, and therefore you categorically need to get great advice. I came across Michael because I was a friend of mine who was a very active entrepreneur and business owner, and had bought and sold multiple companies before I knew him, and he's done a lot more since that time. It was a referral, and I knew the person that gave me the referral to Michael was quite hard, very demanding on the people that work for him and contractors. So his endorsement meant something, and that's been my experience. My experience is Michael's done a phenomenal job for me. It's a complex area, but the stakes are high. So you want to get the right advice, support, and obviously anecdotally, you can get that from other people as well, and from accountants and other people in mastermind, but there's no substitute for good advice, because sometimes the biggest wins are the losses avoided, in not screwing up, in not getting sued, in not losing your existing business, in not having a winding up petition from HMRC. And it's worth its weight in gold. But you can't always measure that on a P&L. You can't measure the fact that you would have got sued, or you would have been exposed to XYZ liability. But, or in addition to that, there can be tremendous upsides. So I do think if you're well skilled and you plant the seeds now, I am certain a good number of people in our mastermind group will succeed in acquiring assets, competitors, customer lists, etc., for an absolute bargain in the coming 12 months and longer, which will set them up strongly for significant growth going forward. I'm not saying that my results are typical, but in the last recession, my revenues across my companies as a group doubled in 2008, doubled in 2009, and doubled again in 2010. And a large proportion of that was directly related to two, or it may have been three. It was definitely at least two. I think it could have been three, though, acquisitions of competitors that I did in that time frame. So it can set you up for massive growth if it's done the right way. So that's my kind of closing piece. So, Michael, a couple of quick fire questions. So Jacqueline asks a question: what's the best way to deal with contractors using legal threats to get paid for work they have not done? That's an interesting question, Jacqueline.
To get paid for work they have not done.
To get paid for work they have not done. Yeah, actually, yeah. Jacqueline, I'm going to ask for clarity. I read that to mean, but it's a bit ambiguous.
Sorry, I'm not sure I follow it.
Yeah, I read that, but Jacqueline, who's still on the line, so clarify the question, Jacqueline. I read that to mean Jacqueline's done some work on a commission basis. She just said work was on a commission basis, and she's not been paid for it. So I think the language in the first. Yeah.
So again, it's communication. Get your terms and conditions right first, and make sure that you get your terms and conditions signed and agreed with your customer before you start the work. In those terms and conditions, you should have all of the armaments that you need, all of the weaponry that you need to get people to pay. So, for example, if you are working on a project and they don't pay you on a milestone date, your terms and conditions should say that you have the right to suspend or pull out or whatever. Also you should charge interest, but you're more likely to get people to pay you to finish the project if you are entitled to suspend operations for non-payment along the way.
If I may interject, Michael, Jacqueline's clarified, and I've misinterpreted. She's now clarified. She's not the contractor. So actually, how I read it now, what I believe she's saying, and she'll correct me again if I mess this up again, is I believe a contractor is using legal threats against her, saying, Jacqueline, you need to pay me, but Jacqueline saying, no, I don't, because the contractor has not done the work. Okay. So she's saying the contractors are wanting me to pay them. She hired the contractor She doesn't believe they've done the work, and yet they're threatening her with legal recourse for not paying.
Okay. So again, the reference point is going to be the contract. It is important to get advice straight away, Jacqueline, to make sure that you know where you stand in relation to these threats. I know you say you don't want to pay them, but you want to make sure that you're not inadvertently caught to do so. If you're advised that you do have a reason not to pay, then a strongly worded response explaining why that's the case and telling these people what to do with their threat is the next step. And if they then do commence proceedings against you, you are entitled to defend those proceedings and defend your contractual position.
Very good. I hope that answers the question, Jacqueline. Okay, I've got one more question, Michael, unless anybody else who's still on the line, and virtually everybody that started this call is still on the line. So, yeah, Will, Mark, Mike, Naz, Rob, etc. Feel free to throw in questions quick and fast. As soon as I run out of questions, we will be done. Next question is, I think it's a statement, but I think it's a valid point. One of the companies I was looking at buying as a share purchase had a lot of liabilities that had appeared on the balance sheet since the last version they showed me. I found this out in early due diligence, but I decided to back out of the deal as the owner had been dishonest and not shared that information with me. I then bought a business from an owner who I feel had shared values with me. I feel this is important when acquiring a business, as those values are intrinsic to the company and its culture.
Certainly also gives you some confidence that you're dealing with someone whose representations you can trust more than the other person.
Yeah, exactly, Michael. Kind of the point you made earlier when Alex was saying about her deferred consideration. The seller had approached her saying, hey, we can pause this for the time being. So you're right. I do think it reminds me of the famous story of Warren Buffett, who apparently agreed a multi-billion-dollar deal on a handshake. And I think that's somewhat misinterpreted, because sometimes people say that as, oh, he doesn't bother with contracts. And clearly that's not the case remotely. It was when he was asked about it, he was saying, no, I know the CEO of the company he was acquiring, and, I'm very confident. I trust him, high values, high ethics. That's why I'm doing the deal. And I know that I'm confident we're going to, between us, work out the details fairly, which again probably speaks to that point of...
Yeah, and also he's got so much money that he can afford to litigate.
Yes, good bonus point. In fact, I'm going to say it on the record again, Michael, I could be wrong on this, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least if Warren Buffett was the richest man in the world again next year. He's not currently. I think he's third or something like that. But the fact is, Warren Buffett has long since, for those that study him, those who follow me know that I do extensively, Berkshire Hathaway, his company, which I think is the 12th biggest company in the world by consolidated revenue, is renowned for performing significantly better in bear markets, i.e. recessions, and being weaker in bull markets. So when times are good, he performs less well. When times are bad, he does great. And the reason why, and this is my interpretation, the reason why is because he's very conservative. So as I understand it, Michael, he is sat on $126 billion in cash waiting to deploy. But if you look at his previous few years' letter to shareholders at the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting, which is right about now, actually, the 2020 one's going to go ahead. He's not been bragging this. He's just been saying, yeah, I know, guys, we're not performing that well. We're just not seeing the deals. We're not seeing the right companies to buy. And, which is kind of code word for him saying, I believe it's code word for him saying things are overpriced.
Yep.
Things are overpriced and a recession's coming. And if you saw a video of him the other week, Michael, somebody asked him about the airlines, and somebody said the opening question was something like, oh, Warren, you lost $6 billion or whatever the number was today. How do you feel? To which he responded, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, I didn't lose $6 billion. because I haven't sold anything. And they said, are you going to sell your shares in Delta or some airline where apparently he has a shareholding? And he went, no. He goes, no, it's an interesting time. It's a turbulent time. And, you know, we'll wait and see. And he seems extraordinarily calm, which makes sense if you're conservative, if you have your assets protected as adequately as they can be, and cash is king. I'm sure, Michael, he's going to be able to pick up some big companies that get exposed as being vulnerable, but he sees significant underlying value in those companies, and then he gets to buy them cheap. This virus will pass. The economies will go from recession, pass through the recession, start coming out the other side, and lo and behold, the share price will rebound, and he will add umpteen billion to his wealth. That's my prediction.
You're optimistic, and I have to say, you're one of the few optimistic voices I've heard. Most people that I talk to are saying that this is going to be worse than the early 90s and possibly as bad as, you know, the 1930s. I don't know.
Yeah. But obviously, clearly my opinions are like belly buttons, Michael. Everybody's got one, and I definitely would take with a huge pinch of salt timing, because Warren Buffett can't time it, then I sure as heck can't. But I do believe in the fundamentals of the market, and I am sure that this will pass. And those that
it will. It will. It's a question of the damage that is done before it happens.
Correct. So that's why, guys, getting educated right now, protecting yourselves and getting suitably educated means that as these opportunities present themselves, you know, without sounding too predatory, if the competition's got it a lot worse than you because of how you've prepared or how you've adapted, then you've got by its very nature, you are going to have advantages. You're going to be ahead of them, which I think is probably a worthwhile endeavor. So with that said, Michael, is any closing thoughts, and perhaps coupled to that, anybody that's got further questions about specifics as it relates to their circumstances, how could they get in touch, or how would you like them to get in touch?
So always very happy to do follow-up calls. Probably the best thing is if you circulate my contact details to anyone who asks. I echo what you said earlier. This is a time to appraise where you are now, not to worry about it after the damage is done. Words to that effect, you said. I think certainly worth a bit of introspection from everybody's point of view to make sure that you can get through the next 3 months. And if you feel you can't and adjustments are required, then you do need to think about what advice you need to take. In terms of acquiring competitors or opportunities out there, please don't just go and buy the first thing you see. Make sure it is structured properly so that you're buying the right bits of it, and that you're not buying the skeletons in the cupboard, and that you're not going to have a liquidator coming down the road chasing you for extra money after the event.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope that was helpful for you. We will put up the recording, and obviously, as Michael said, feel free to reach out to me, and I will make introductions where they are requested. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody, and I will see you next time.
Thank you.